Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I've got an intense and chilling story to share with you, one that will keep you on the edge of your seat. This is not just any ordinary story. It's a tale of power, corruption, and the supernatural. A confrontation between a legendary fighter and an enemy unlike anything he's ever faced before. Imagine waking up to a normal day, only to find yourself hunted by something not entirely human. That's exactly what happened to Mike Tyson, a retired champion, when he crossed paths with a mysterious, sinister officer with a dark secret. What started as an act of racial profiling quickly spiraled into something far more terrifying. A battle not just for justice, but for survival. What did Mike discover? Who or what was Officer Blake? And most importantly, is the danger really gone? Stick around to find out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling and mysterious stories. Let's dive into it. The morning air was thick with an eerie stillness as the first rays of sunlight struggled to break through the heavy mist that clung to the suburban streets. A strange, unnatural silence filled the neighborhood. No birds singing, no distant hum of passing cars, just an emptiness that sent a quiet chill down Mike Tyson's spine as he stirred from his sleep. Something felt off. Mike sat up in bed, his instincts sharper than most, honed through years of battles in the ring. The air inside his room felt unnaturally cold, despite the warm summer season. He glanced at the clock, 4:45 a.m. His body, conditioned by discipline, always woke early, but today an unsettling sensation lingered in his chest. He rubbed his eyes, shaking off the unease, before rising to his feet, stretching his broad shoulders with a practiced motion. As he walked to his window, his gaze fell upon his most prized possession, his vintage black convertible parked in the driveway. The car, a sleek, polished testament to his journey from hardship to triumph, stood as a symbol of everything he had fought for, but this morning it seemed different. Its surface, usually gleaming, looked almost too dark, absorbing the dim light instead of reflecting it. The windshield had a faint, fog-like residue, despite the warm air, and for a fleeting moment, Mike could have sworn he saw a shadow move inside the car. His pulse quickened. Years in the ring had trained him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. He exhaled, pushing away the sensation. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on his mind. Determined to shake off the unease, he changed into a casual tracksuit, grabbed his keys, and stepped outside. The moment his feet touched the pavement, the world around him seemed to pause. The mist, thick and suffocating, refused to lift, curling around his car like ghostly fingers. The silence was unnatural, heavy with something unseen. He stopped short, his eyes locking onto the vehicle. The door was slightly ajar. His heart pounded once, a sharp, instinctive thud against his ribs. He never left it unlocked. Slowly, cautiously, he approached, his fists clenching at his sides. Every step forward felt heavier, the atmosphere growing denser around him. He reached for the handle, his breath steady but deliberate. With one firm pull, he yanked the door open, his muscles tensed for whatever was waiting inside. Nothing. The interior was empty, yet the lingering scent of cigarette smoke hung in the air. A chill ran down his spine. He hadn't smoked in years. Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life. A distorted voice slithered through the static, garbled and incomprehensible at first, then clear as day. "Not your place, champ." The voice was deep, mocking, and laced with something Mike couldn't quite place, something inhuman. Mike's breath caught. He slammed the door shut, his pulse a hammer in his ears. Who the hell was messing with him? Shaking off the unease, he forced himself into motion, sliding into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, the familiar rumble grounding him. Maybe it was just a prank, a stupid prank. But deep down, in the part of him that had survived the darkest moments of his past, he knew this was only the beginning. The drive to the diner was unnervingly quiet. The thick morning fog clung to the streets like a living thing, shifting and curling around Mike's car as if reluctant to let him pass. His fingers gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Something about the morning just felt wrong. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, flickering in and out like dying embers. As he pulled into the parking lot, The unsettling sensation in his chest only grew stronger. The usual sounds of the morning, chatter from early risers, the distant hum of traffic were missing. The world felt muted, as if something had drained the life from it. He parked his car in his usual spot, shaking his head at himself. It's just another morning, just breakfast. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw him. A figure standing at the edge of the lot, half obscured by the fog. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the dim morning light. Officer Blake. Mike had never met him before, but there was something immediately wrong about him. His posture was too still, too rigid, his face unreadable. But it was his eyes that sent a cold shiver down Mike's spine, dark, hollow, like they absorbed light instead of reflecting it. He wasn't just watching Mike, he was studying him. Mike exhaled sharply and looked away, pushing open the door of the diner. The warm aroma of coffee and fresh pancakes rushed to greet him, momentarily washing away the unease. "Mike Tyson," a familiar voice called. Millie, the old waitress, beamed from behind the counter, her hands on her hips. "Didn't think I'd see you this early. You okay, hun?" Mike forced a smile, nodding as he slid into his usual booth. "Yeah, just one of those mornings." Millie studied him for a second before nodding. "Pancakes and coffee, then?" "You know me too well," Mike chuckled, but his mind was still outside, on Officer Blake. Through the window, he saw the cop step forward. Slowly, deliberately. Each step felt calculated, like a predator closing in. Then Blake did something that made Mike's stomach drop. He ran a hand across the hood of his car. It wasn't just a touch. It was slow, possessive. His fingers traced the contours of the vehicle as if savoring every inch. Then he leaned down, peering inside the windshield, his mouth twisting into a smirk. Mike's grip on his coffee mug tightened. His blood simmered. Blake suddenly looked up, locking eyes with him through the glass. And he grinned. The kind of grin that made Mike's gut twist. A predator's grin. Mike's breath slowed. He had seen plenty of men like this before, both in and outside the ring. Men who fed on intimidation. Men who enjoyed pushing others into a fight they thought they'd already won. But this was different. Blake took one final slow step back from the car, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something. Then, without breaking eye contact, he mouthed something. Mike frowned, his muscles tensing. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read them just fine. "You don't belong here." A chill ran down Mike's spine. He wasn't sure if Blake was talking about the neighborhood, or something far worse. Mike Tyson had faced intimidation before. He had stood toe-to-toe with the fiercest fighters in the ring, endured the harshest blows, and had always walked away standing. But as he finished his breakfast, a gnawing sensation in his chest told him that this fight was different. Something was wrong with Officer Blake. Through the diner's window, Mike could see him, still standing by his car, his posture eerily still, his presence radiating something more than just hostility. It was something unnatural. The air around him seemed heavier, distorted, as if the light itself refused to fully illuminate his figure. The moment Mike stepped outside, the world seemed to shift. The usual morning warmth was gone, replaced by an unnatural chill that crawled up his spine. The breeze had vanished. Even the birds were silent. Blake was waiting for him, leaning casually against the convertible, his baton twirling between his fingers in a lazy, almost hypnotic motion. His smirk was still there, curling at the edges of his lips like he knew something Mike didn't. Mike stopped a few feet away, his instincts screaming at him. He kept his voice calm, measured. "Something I can help you with, officer?" Blake clicked his tongue, shaking his head slowly. "Nice car," he said, his voice unnervingly smooth, almost too even. "You steal it?" Mike's muscles tensed. He exhaled through his nose, keeping his composure. He had dealt with racism before. He had heard these words before. But there was something different about the way Blake said them. There was no hesitation, no anger, just certainty. Mike pulled out his registration from his pocket, unfolding it with steady hands. "Bought and paid for," he said, offering it. Blake's eyes flickered, just for a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he took the paper, looked at it, and smiled. And then he let it drop. The paper fluttered to the pavement, landing softly between them. Blake didn't even glance at it. His eyes remained locked onto Mike's. Black pools of nothingness. A slow, creeping rage began to build in Mike's chest. He wasn't about to let this man play mind games with him. "Pick it up," he said, his voice even but firm. Blake chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo unnaturally. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. His breath, when it hit Mike's skin, was cold. "You people think you can just walk into places you don't belong," Blake whispered, his grin widening. Then, before Mike could react, Blake swung his baton. A sharp crack split the air as the metal struck the headlight of the convertible, shattering it instantly. The broken glass scattered across the pavement like jagged pieces of ice. The air around them seemed to pulse, the pressure building, suffocating. The crowd, which had barely noticed the confrontation before, now turned their heads. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that whatever was happening here was about to explode. Mike took a slow, controlled breath, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Blake, sensing his patience unraveling, smirked again. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. Mike watched, his jaw tight, as the officer lit it, took a long, deep drag, then, without breaking eye contact, casually flicked the burning ember into the car, a spark, then flames. The fire spread unnaturally fast, crawling across the pristine leather seats like living veins of molten orange. The crowd gasped, stepping back in horror. Mike, his entire body thrumming with barely controlled rage, took a step forward. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice like thunder before the storm. Blake didn't move. He just stood there, watching the fire, watching Mike, his shadow stretching too far across the pavement, as if it had a life of its own. Then he leaned in, voice barely a whisper. "Make me stop." And that's when Mike knew this wasn't just about racism. This was something else. The flames inside Mike's convertible crackled and spread unnaturally fast, moving like living veins of fire across the pristine leather seats. The orange glow flickered in the reflection of Officer Blake's cold, unblinking eyes as he stood there, his smirk widening into something that sent a chill through the gathered crowd. Mike's chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths, but every fiber of his being screamed to act. He had spent years mastering the art of restraint, but this wasn't just provocation. This was a direct attack. On him. On everything he had worked for. The people watching were frozen, some with phones raised, others too stunned to move. The thick smoke curled into the air, but it wasn't just normal smoke. It moved wrong. It twisted and coiled as if something inside it was watching. Then came the final straw. Blake, without looking, kicked the registration paper into the fire. The document, proof of his ownership, curled up in the heat, its edges turning black. Mike exhaled slowly. Enough. His body moved before his mind fully registered the decision. A blur of motion, years of instinct took over as he lunged forward. Blake barely reacted in time. He shifted, raising his baton to strike again, but he was too slow. Mike caught it. The impact between them sent a sharp crack through the air, a metallic clash that echoed through the parking lot. The crowd gasped. Blake's smirk faltered for the first time. He had underestimated him. Mike's grip on the baton was like steel. His fingers closed around it, and with one fluid motion, he twisted. The baton was yanked from Blake's grasp, clattering onto the pavement. The moment the weapon left his hands, something changed. The air dropped 10 degrees. The shadows around Blake flickered. Too long, too stretched, as if they weren't just his. His face for a brief second blurred, like static on a broken TV. Then the rage returned. Blake lunged. His fist came fast, wild, untrained. But Mike had spent a lifetime studying movement. He sidestepped effortlessly. The officer stumbled forward, caught off balance. The moment of vulnerability was all Mike needed. He struck, not a punch to kill, not a wild attack, just a precise, calculated jab. His knuckles connected with Blake's ribs. The sound that came out of the officer's mouth wasn't human. A wet, guttural hiss, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Blake staggered back, eyes wide, as if something inside him hadn't expected the pain. And then, for a fraction of a second, his face shifted. Mike saw it. the thing beneath the skin. It wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a racist cop abusing his power. It was something else entirely. Blake's hands trembled at his sides, his pupils shrunk to pinpoints. His breathing was ragged, and something dark leaked from the corner of his lips. Then he grinned again. But this time, his teeth weren't normal. They were too sharp. The fire behind them flared higher, as if responding to whatever was inside him. Mike took a step back, his heartbeat steady, but his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting something wearing a man's face. Blake wiped the dark liquid from his mouth with the back of his hand. His voice came out wrong, layered, like two voices speaking at once. "That all you got, champ?" The crowd began to back away. They had come to witness a confrontation, maybe even a fight. But now even they could sense it. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Blake cracked his neck, the motion too fluid, too unnatural. His shoulders rolled, and then, with a twist of his jaw, his face snapped back into perfect shape. As if nothing had happened. Mike didn't flinch. He had faced demons before, his own, and the ones that life threw at him. If this thing thought it could intimidate him, it was dead wrong. The fire reflected in his dark eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Mike smiled. If this thing wanted a fight, it was about to get one hell of a lesson. The moment stretched, too long, too unnatural. The fire behind them cast twisted shadows across the pavement, flickering in ways that didn't make sense. The crowd was no longer murmuring in shock. They were silent, frozen, as if something beyond their comprehension was unfolding before them. Mike Tyson had fought monsters before, men who tried to break him, who tested his will and strength. But this wasn't a man. This was something else. Blake's grin remained sharp, his body too still, his eyes black pools reflecting the burning wreckage of Mike's beloved car. The stench of smoke mixed with something fouler, something old, something rotten. Then Blake moved. It wasn't like a normal attack. There was no shift in weight, no tightening of muscles. He was just suddenly there. One moment standing still, the next lunging with terrifying speed, his hands reaching for Mike's throat. Mike reacted on instinct. Years of training took over. He pivoted, dodging Blake's grasp by mere inches, feeling the cold air that followed his movement, colder than it should have been. He countered with a lightning-fast hook to the ribs. Impact. Blake's body jerked from the force, but he didn't go down. Instead, he laughed. A broken, rasping sound. Mike had never hit someone and felt nothing. No tension in the bones, no muscle resistance, like he had just punched into empty space. But then something did change. Blake stumbled, just for a second. His face twisted in pain, as if something inside of him hadn't expected Mike to fight back. Mike's eyes narrowed. So he could be hurt. Blake's head snapped back toward him, his grin stretching wider. "That all you got, champ?" His voice came out layered, two voices overlapping. The crowd finally started to stir, realizing that what was happening was not normal. A few people took cautious steps back, some ran. Blake straightened, cracking his neck in a way that sounded wrong. Then he lunged again, this time with inhuman speed. Mike was ready. Blake's arm swung forward, but this time Mike caught it. A shock ripped through him. The moment his fingers closed around Blake's wrist, it was like grabbing something that wasn't fully there, like pressing his hand into ice-cold fog. But he held on. And squeezed. Blake let out a sharp, guttural hiss, his first real reaction of pain. Mike twisted, using Blake's own momentum against him. In one fluid movement, he flipped the officer over his shoulder and slammed him onto the pavement. The ground shook. Blake hit hard, his body twisting unnaturally as he skidded back. The impact should have knocked him out. It would have broken a normal man's ribs. But Blake wasn't normal. Instead of groaning in pain, he twitched. His limbs jerked, his body convulsing. The shadows around him writhed as if alive. Then, for a fraction of a second, his form flickered. And Mike saw it. The thing beneath. Not just a man, something else wearing a man's skin. It looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, Mike saw something other than arrogance. He saw recognition. Fear. Blake's breathing was ragged. He tried to get up, but this time his hands shook. His form was flickering, unraveling at the edges. Mike stepped forward, his gaze steady. No hesitation, no fear. "You wanted to see what I'm made of," he said, his voice calm, steady, deadly. "Well, now you know." Blake's expression twisted. The smirk was gone. In its place was something raw, panic. Then, from the distance, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights flashed against the fog, cutting through the eerie darkness. The real police had arrived, and suddenly, Blake was gone. One blink, and he was just not there anymore. The space where he had landed was empty, as if he had never been there at all. But Mike knew better. He could still feel it, the lingering chill in the air, the faint whisper in the smoke. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun.